On tablets, ATMs, at the doctor's office, and at fast food restaurants. They're everywhere, even in cars. And now, right in the middle of the dashboard.
In short, I think that touchscreens are the worst possible interface to put in a car that you still have to drive.
While Abul Samid is not the only one critical of touchscreens, they're not going anywhere. In 2022, nearly 80% of all vehicles will be equipped with a center stack display, meaning a screen in the center of the dashboard. Nearly all of those will be touch screens. That's a big jump from 2014.
Because the auto industry, wants to be seen as forward-thinking. They don't want to seem like dinosaurs.
But there are some concerns about safety and usability. The technology is not inherently bad. Plus, the future could look vastly different.
It's not as simple as touchscreen good or bad. It's about what you're using the touchscreen for.
The roots of the modern infotainment system go back decades. Changes in regulation are thought to have sped up their adoption.
Touchscreens, we think really are an outgrowth of the requirements to put in backup cameras probably about 10 years ago in the vehicle. So you had to have the screen on the display so someone could see what the camera was picking up.
As automakers installed screens in cars, new possibilities began to open up. So did new demands.
The transition happened in a relatively fast time, in a relatively, quick way. And obviously, the reason is that the amount of information, the amount of interaction you have with the car is increasing. So the demand of having more and more options to interact with the car needs to increase.
It's a nice way to manufacture a vehicle because now you can customize that interface for the features in the car.
It's also a lot simpler and cheaper. New companies like Tesla rely heavily on touchscreens in their vehicles, much more than many legacy manufacturers. This does allow them to simplify the interior design of the car and spare themselves a lot of work.
It actually costs a lot of money to engineer all of these buttons and switches and to have the wiring, because you've got to have wires that run to all of these different physical controls. Doing the validation of all this, making sure that it's going to be durable over the life of a car. Doing all of that in software is a lot cheaper.
But it's also what people have come to expect.
For customers, it used to be you get into your car, you hit all the right buttons, right? You turn your radio on and off you go. That's not how it works for my kids, right? I mean, they are on their phone in the home, they get into the car, and a traditional car feels like 2 steps back in time.
One of the complaints about touchscreens is that you have to really look at the screen to use it.
If you have let's say you have a volume knob. I could look at the road, I could feel for the volume knob, I know how much I've turned it. Even if I had a button, buttons aren't as good necessarily for volume, but at least I feel that my finger is on the button, I press it, I know it goes down.
A touchscreen is a little bit different because in most cases you don't actually get tactile feedback that you've pushed the screen correctly or you've pushed the button in the proper location.
I wouldn't want a touch screen for my hazard lights, for my turd signal, for the horn, for volume, or people to turn off the radio quickly.
Also important is how the software is set up. Some systems, like Tesla's, require users to click through several menus to get to features. Since 2021, the company has recalled about 265,000 cars for issues with touchscreens. Even advantages of touchscreens can be potential drawbacks. Updates and attempts to improve the system can confuse drivers.
We've heard from many Tesla customers, when they've updated the Model 3 and the Model Y interface, they can no longer find their rear defroster. They knew where it was before, and now they can't find it because now it's hidden in a menu and it's not there on the screen. That's a problem.
J.D. Power's initial quality study, which surveys owners after the first 90 days of ownership, found that infotainment systems were a serious sore spot. While the largest number of complaints focused on voice activation and smartphone connectivity, touchscreens were the third most common source of dissatisfaction. Even the group's vehicle dependability study, which surveys owners after 3 years of ownership, found that infotainment systems were the biggest source of complaints still. On safety, it's tough to say accurately how big of a problem driver distraction is. UK-based consultancy, the Transport Research Laboratory, in a 2020 report found that interacting with a touchscreen slowed reaction times by several car lengths. Reaction times were slower than for drivers who were texting while driving or even intoxicated.
We know that crash risk starts to increase when you take your eyes off the road, 2 to 3 seconds.
This is psychologist David Strayer. In a 2017 study, he and a number of other researchers found that interacting with screens could require drivers to take their eyes off the road for a lot longer than the 2 to 3 second threshold he's describing. Some tasks took up to 40 seconds.
Text message takes about 4.5 seconds. And we know that in terms of the crash risk, we see that you're about 6 times more likely to be involved in a crash, which is why most states outlaw texting while driving.
Strayer and research partners at AAA compared Apple CarPlay and Google Android systems with those installed by manufacturers. They found that big text systems were a bit easier to use than the native ones. However, they still demanded attention from users. Another study in 2019 found these systems were harder to use for older drivers than younger ones. And the US population is aging. Road fatalities decreased in the US from 1980 until 2014. That's mainly due to stricter road safety laws, improved roads, and sturdier cars. Over the past decade, those numbers have started climbing again. Strayer thinks the proliferation of distractions is one of the likely factors contributing to a recent spike in road deaths.
So we've actually seen fatalities going up, and that's fatalities adjusted per million miles driven. So something's going on that's actually making our roads less safe. And it corresponds with the kind of increased prevalence of cell phones and touch screens and all the electronics in the vehicle.
Some manufacturers are still asking for knobs and buttons and similar controls for at least some functions. Brands such as Mazda and BMW are including other tools for controlling screens, such as a wheel in the center console.
I personally prefer that because I find it gives more precision in control. I can twist it, I can glance at the screen briefly and give it a twist without having to think so hard about hitting the touch targets.
Despite the concerns, it's unlikely that the touchscreen is going anywhere. After all, they are present in nearly every part of daily life. And they're getting bigger in size. Mercedes debuted its MBUX Hyperscreen at the Consumer Electronics Show in January 2021. The massive screen covers the entire dashboard. But companies are also trying to design screens that work differently, in some cases to mitigate some of the risks touchscreens pose. Continental has what it calls a shy touchscreen that can disappear into the dashboard, or one that's used by a passenger without distracting a driver. There are other technologies. Natural 3D displays show images holographically, or 3D touchscreens that have a raised surface in places which can function as a button or a switch. Other tools can be either alternatives or supplements to screens. Voice controls are improving. Heads-up displays, which project images onto a windshield, are becoming more sophisticated.
You're going from head-up displays to augmented reality head-up displays to projector technology in the car, where you project the information on the windshield, to what we call a big innovation is scenic view, where you project the display information on a windshield. So there is a huge area outside of screens or as an alternative to screens.
Of course, as this is happening, technologies are emerging that may enable drivers to take their eyes off the road entirely.
Now a touchscreen's not as big a deal. Or as you start to move into things like robo-taxis, where you're not driving at all, and software is driving you around.